Autism and Spirituality. Psyche, Self and Spirit in People on the Autism Spectrum by Olga Bogdashina. Olga Bogdashina argues persuasively that the spiritual development of those on the autism spectrum is in fact way ahead of that of their neurotypical peers. She describes differences in sensory perceptual, cognitive and linguistic development that make spiritual and religious experience come more easily to those on the autism spectrum, and presents a coherent framework for understanding the routes of spiritual development and spiritual intelligence of giftedness within this group. Using research evidence and many real examples to illustrate her hypotheses, she suggests practical ways of supporting the spiritual needs of people on the autism spectrum and their families. This book gives a voice to both verbal and non-verbal individuals on the autism spectrum, whose spiritual and religious experiences, though unconventional, are meaningful and profound. Since I really like Olga Bogdashina's books, I ordered this one right away and already love it. The aim of this book is to examine some of the key issues and insights into the way autistic people experience the world and their spirituality. As a bonus, this exploration will provide us with an opportunity to understand ourselves and increase our own perception and understanding of the diversity in humankind. My primary source is writings, presentations, and personal communication with individuals on the autism spectrum. I believe narrative methods may be the most effective means of depicting the subjective experiences of people with autism in ways that are faithful to the meaning they give to their lives. These methods, narratives, reflect the emotional dimension of human experience, which is often absent from the objective accounts of those who work with autistic individuals. From the very beginning of human history, at the center of human life was man himself. While attempting to understand the world around him, to survive and adapt to it, the meaning of life has always been at the top of the agenda. In whichever era humans may live, some representatives of Homo sapiens, whom we would call today highly intelligent people, not necessarily possessing paper qualifications, but rather those who are seeking enlightenment and educating themselves in the process, look for answers to very important questions. When the question of survival has been answered, other more difficult questions emerge. How shall I live in this world with others, both human and non-human? And how shall I live with myself? Myself. Every 5 to 7 years, each and every one of us experiences a crisis. So, we have to change our worldview and at the same time relocate and re-evaluate our place in the world. What do I want from this life? Where is my place in this life? A baby growing into a toddler can feel as if she were the center of the universe, with all the people around her admiring her every movement, word and smile, meeting all her needs and fulfilling every wish. Not always. Then she goes to school, and what a surprise! There are 30 or 40 centers of the universe in one classroom. The child has to adapt, change the worldview, and find her place in this new cosmos, where many other stars are choosing their orbits. When at school, our basic needs are met by our parents and other adults, but after the final year exams, more adaptations are expected from us. And the decision, now what, must be made. Still more adaptations and re-evaluations come with career choices and starting families, and so on and so forth. While some are too busy building their cozy nests and restructuring their lives, aiming to get to the top, whatever they think the top represents. There are others who keep looking for answers to questions like, what am I? Why am I here on this earth? What is the meaning of life in general, and my life in particular? And a more difficult question, how shall I live my life in this world if there is God? Or an even harder one, how shall I live my life if there isn't? In a way, I was lucky. When 25 years ago I learned that my son had autism by a specialist who actually had the knowledge and experience that my son had classic autism, was one of the happiest days in my life. It was not because I thought that autism was something good. At the time I knew nothing about the condition. It was because I got the name and could research its denotative meaning, finding some solutions in the process. For many years, the word autism has had no connotation for me, neither good nor bad, as it is in the category autism. Now what? That is something I need to address and make adjustments for. Instead of describing outer behaviors, what it looks like from the outside, autism is viewed through inner realities, what it feels like from inside. This will restrict it by excluding those who, though exhibiting outer behaviors of social interaction impairments, are normal in their perception and thinking, and it will include those who have developed strategies to appear normal, masking, while their inner realities, caused by differences in sensory perception, thinking and language development, are strikingly different from the culturally constructed ones. For autistic people, autism is an inner reality, and it can appear on the surface, disappear and reappear in various degrees in different circumstances. Autism as an experience is described as a very complex interplay between identity, personality, environment, experience, and the equipment with which to make sense of that experience. Donna Williams, 1998, page 9. defines autism simply as an internal human normality with the volume turned up. You can find out more about Olga Bogdashina on her website, olgabogdashina.com. She has written many really good books that look at autism from another perspective. And there is a second edition out now about communication issues in autism and Asperger's syndrome. She also stresses the importance of identifying each individual's nonverbal language, which can be visual, tactile, kinesthetic, auditory, olfactory, or gustatory, to establish verbal communication. Yeah, I think this is really important, because if you are visual, it's very different from being tactile or auditory. You will need other ways to learn, for example. Since my dad fled the communist regime in 1969 to leave everything behind, his parents, his sister, his life, coming to Switzerland was basically nothing, and definitely had suffered from Soviet trauma, as they call it. I can highly relate to what Olga Bogdashina writes about having grown up in the communist era, but she seems to have been lucky. She writes, "My PhD supervisor at the Moscow Linguistic University did not care about my not being one representative of intelligentsia to 7 working-class representatives, and appreciated me for my abilities in the field of linguistics. During those years we became friends, and at our regular consultations talked not only about the historical syntax of the Old English language, but many other things that at the time could be discussed only in the kitchen, the place where some families gathered to listen to Western radio stations, which is something that was actually highly forbidden, to discuss in whispers banned works and personalities like, for example, Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, grumble about the incompetence of ridiculous ideas produced by party apparatchiks. Yeah, I have observed that also in cults, and when a government becomes so restrictive and dominant, you just find this very weird reductionist stupidity. And then you have to find ways to communicate in secret. "We are just kidding" was a private joke that helped to reduce a perhaps unjustified fear of being bugged with all the unpleasant and dangerous consequences. We don't think the apartment is bugged, but what if it is? It was in my scientific supervisor's kitchen at the age of 28 that I held the Bible in my hands for the first time. I didn't become religious, but it made me think that scientific atheism might not be the only possible way to interpret our reality. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. At the time, I lived in the Ukraine, and all of a sudden, religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, was welcomed by the very apparatchiks who had banned it many years ago. The party functionaries staged televised performances of burning their red books, the Communist Party member cards, and rushing to the cathedrals to light a candle in honor of Jesus Christ. The change of the worldview brings changes in definitions of concepts, terminology, and new questions to be asked. Issues of religious beliefs of autistic individuals are not discussed in this book, though this does not mean that they cannot communicate at all. In fact, they are communicating all the time. Often it is so-called normal people who cannot interpret their communication, or even insist that this or that non-verbal person is unable to communicate. Yeah, but then, if you observe animals, their body language, this is a very, very clear language. According to the Bible, language is at the very heart of creation. Adam became the master of the world when he gave names to everything around him. He created the human world, the world identifiable by humans. And that is what we have now. We have names for objects, plants, animals, abstract notions. And when new ones appear, we provide new labels, thus drawing boundaries around our world. If something is outside the bubble, it goes unnoticed. With the help of words, humans created the conceptual and linguistic world they would inhabit. Adam's job done. And this created world is being passed from generation to generation through cultural traditions. But what happened? When some children do not develop verbal language, often the case in autism, it does not mean they have no language at all. Rather, that they develop non-verbal languages that reconstruct the world differently. Understanding and learning these non-verbal languages, languages of experience, comprising visual, tactile, auditory, smell, etc. images, will help not only to communicate with autistic individuals speaking these languages, but also to understand spiritual, especially mystical experiences. One of the features of which is their ineffability. The experiences should be felt. They cannot be described verbally, but are expressed in non-verbal sensed images. We have to distinguish the denotative and connotative meanings of the word. Denotation refers to the literal meaning of a word, i.e. the dictionary definition, while connotation refers to the associations that are connected to it. Connotative meaning is charged with emotions, usually very similar for all members of a certain culture, but each individual can have a very different emotional shade based on his or her experiences and knowledge. For example, if you look up the word autism in a medical dictionary, its denotative meaning is a pervasive developmental disorder characterized by severe deficits in social interaction and communication, by an extremely limited range of activities and interests, and often by the presence of repetitive stereotype behaviors. But the connotations of this word can be very different for different people, depending on personal situation, knowledge about the condition, support available to the person with autism and the family, and so on. Here are just a few examples of the connotative meanings of this word. A high-functioning person with autism who has learned to cope with her problems while building on her strengths. Autism is a marvelous occurrence of nature, not a tragic example of the human mind gone wrong. By O'Neill, 1999, page 14. In stark contrast, Mrs. N, a parent of a child with severe autism, says about autism, "Autism is like a death in the family. It has stolen my child." The connotative meanings are so different that understanding and interpretation of the situations are sure to be different. It is even more complicated with the word spirituality. There is no agreement on its denotative meaning and too many connotative charges with a wide range of emotional shades attached to it, from a private person to a stupid one. Often it is connotation that leads to a change in a denotative meaning of the word. For example, the word idiot, from Greek idiotes, had a literal meaning of a private person. Then it was expanded to mean layman, one who lacks professional knowledge. From the end of the 13th century it was used to define a person so mentally deficient as to be incapable of ordinary reasoning. And at some stage it became a technical term in a diagnostic classification system, no longer in use, to denote a person of profound mental retardation having a mental age below 3 years and generally being unable to learn connected speech or guard against common dangers. Nowadays it means a foolish or stupid person and is perceived as offensive. Recently, political correctness has invaded the linguistic world we live in. Some people have started seeing negative connotations in neutral words. It is one thing to ban such offensive as perceived by the majority words as, for example, retard, but quite another when some individuals are offended by everyday language because they see negativity wherever they look, and instead of fighting their own impulsive negative feelings, they impose their own meaning onto the words, changing perceptions and making people see what is not there. These very few individuals see offense in everything and anything, and insist on banning dozens of words because of their so-called negative connotations. Funnily enough, before the ban, very few people could see anything offensive in blacklisting or brainstorming. Another dangerous trend is to capture good words and redefine them in a way that suits one particular group. Often, intellectual primitives contaminate and destroy good words, and that is exactly what has happened in the field of autism, where some, very few, individuals police the internet and dictate which words can and which ones cannot be used while discussing autism. I will try to clearly define the concepts we are going to deal with. It is not uncommon that people talk about the same phenomenon using different terms to label it, or that when we discuss vague ideas we struggle to define what we are talking about. Any of these scenarios can make discussion meaningless. So it is necessary to define the main concepts. Defining autism. Autism is traditionally defined as a lifelong complex disability that typically manifests itself during the first 3 years of life and affects the way a person communicates and relates to people around him or her, although it is a condition with a wide-ranging degree of severity. All those affected have problems in the area of social interaction, social communication, and restricted, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. Though conventional, this definition is not necessarily satisfactory, and more researchers emphasize the need to reconsider it. The problem is that the diagnostic symptoms are behaviors that are not reliable, as they may be caused by different factors. Some authors urge for a distinction between different autisms, as different causes can lead to the same clinical manifestation of the condition. The symptoms we can see, i.e. behaviors, can be misleading. In this book, autism is seen as the intense world syndrome, Markram, Rinaldi and Markram 2007, a condition with multiple etiology, genetic and/or environmental factors in which all traditional diagnostic criteria, impairments in social interaction, communication, and inflexibility of thoughts and behaviors are rooted in different sensory perceptions, sensory overload, and hypersensitivity. Autistic people perceive, feel, and remember too much. Faced with a bombarding, confusing, baffling, and often painful environment, autistic infants withdraw into their own world by shutting down their sensory systems. This brings unfavorable consequences for their social and linguistic development, while their cognitive and emotional development follows an atypical route. Is this book practical? No and yes. No, if you are looking for bullet points of what to do and what not to do, because it does not provide ready-made recipes to fix autistic behaviors. And yes, if you want to understand how some autistic individuals experience their inner worlds and how these worlds shape the spiritual dimension of their lives, it does provide some explanations of why the connection between autism and spirituality is so strong. To fully appreciate the spiritual perspectives of autistic individuals, we have to take into account their specific ways of perceiving and processing information about the environment and their own selves. Spirituality plays a significant role in the lives of many autistic individuals and their families. It is time we opened our minds to a diversity of interpretations of human experiences, and without any acquired bias towards these phenomena, we should respect individuals' ways of perceiving and understanding the world, the meaning of life, and yes, mystery. Spiritual attributes and a childlike, naive, and innocent belief in the possibility of achieving heaven on earth. Mishkin can be seen as a Russian holy fool, hence the title of the novel, The Idiot. Interestingly, many characteristics of Prince Mishkin correspond to the symptoms of autism. The majority of critics in the West consider this novel as one of Dostoevsky's weakest works, some complaining that the good prince makes everyone's life harder and achieves nothing. For me, The Idiot is a masterpiece, along with Dostoevsky's other novels, such as The Brothers Karamazov, Demons and Crime and Punishment. What critics do not take into account is that The Idiot was never supposed to be a fairy tale with a happy ever after ending. It is a tragic story, and the tragedy is not that the character achieves nothing, but rather that the world is not ready for him. Here we can see a clear parallel with autism, as Jim Sinclair expresses it powerfully in his classic essay, Don't Mourn for Us. The tragedy is not that we're here, but that your world has no place for us to be. Prince Mushkin is a tragic figure, not because of his intuitive feelings and moral attitudes, allowing him not only to see, but actually feel the cruelty people around him inflict on each other, and come to the rescue of those who have been wronged, even if only with comforting words and understanding. But because in a world where belief in God is replaced with belief in nil, for Dostoevsky, atheism is a faith in nothing. Amorality flourishes, and Prince Mishkin with his virtues and principles, living his life of honesty and humility, becomes an idiot. There are at least two types of purpose of life, practical and spiritual ones. On the one hand, humans have to deal with everyday objects and notions to make their life functional and protected from outside dangers. On the other hand, they have their own self-consciousness and spiritual existence to consider. Bergson urged people not to be satisfied with any purely naturalistic interpretation of mental life, but rather to understand the qualities and abilities within themselves, which shifts the focus from interpretations of the impressions of the external world and applying them to satisfy bodily and practical needs to the recognition of the spiritual value of the human nature, of a personality capable of obtaining the understanding of the life of the spirit, with needs beyond bodily and intellectual satisfaction. Recently, the concept of spirituality has attracted a lot of attention from both researchers and lay public, and research papers and books on the spiritual dimension of different groups of people have been published. At the long last, there is some recognition of the necessity to understand the spiritual dimension in autism. The first book devoted to spirituality and autism was written by a professional working with autistic individuals, followed by a trilogy written by an adult with Asperger's syndrome, and quite a few books written by parents of autistic children. From the perspective of different religious denominations, all the research on spirituality suggests new and more creative ways of helping people, both with disabilities and so-called normal, to find their place in this world and live meaningful lives. What is important in the context of psychiatry is the idea that spirituality is at the heart of what gives life meaning, offering people both a genuine sense of purpose and a warm sense of belonging. It becomes a source of energy and motivation, the perfect antidote to depression. In the past, in some cultures, hearing voices was seen as communication from a deity. Joan of Arc was instructed by a voice to lead troops and won the battle. Shamans are respected for their ability to enter the other worlds and to heal the sick with help from their other worlds connections. Being biologically predisposed to spirituality means that all of us can potentially experience it. The main restrictions seem to be our preoccupation with everyday activities, lack of time, or sometimes lack of a desire to open up to these experiences, and or being socially conditioned, pre-programmed to brush aside anything that has not been scientifically proven and relegated to the New Age stuff. However, though a natural human predisposition and not a cultural construct, spirituality cannot be identified outside a cultural context, which can either nurture or suppress it. Long-term research of the state of spirituality in modern societies by Hay and Nye, 2006, for example, has shown that the modern Western world is more often than not destructive to the natural spirituality of human beings. While autism is not a culture in the strict anthropological sense of the word, it functions as a culture, as it affects the ways autistic individuals behave, understand, and communicate with the world. As the original experience of the world of autistic children is sensory-based, their original internal language as a tool of formulation and expressing thought consists of sensory perceptual multidimensional images. This language becomes central to their intellectual and emotional development, making it closer to the original vision in terms of Robinson's 1983 conceptualization, and thus closer to spirituality as pre-linguistic, non-linguistic experience. Spirituality is associated with universal love, independent of any specific religious denominations, mystery and personal involvement with the universe, whatever is there. Farmer, 1992, sees spirituality as something larger than any religion. Although historically, spirituality has been closely connected with religion, it is logically prior to it. Individuals with autism. Some people, including many professionals, deny even the possibility of spiritual or religious awareness in children with autism. They doubt that so-called low-functioning autistic individuals, especially those whom Lorna Wing calls aloof and passive individuals, living in their own world, unwilling or unable to start and maintain interaction with others, can be spiritual because they do not seem to be aware of anything going on around them. Then, those who are high-functioning, active but odd in Wing's classification, seem to be too rigid and too literal to understand such abstract concepts as religion and spirituality. One of the arguments of those who think that spirituality in autism may be problematic is that people with autism, especially at the low-functioning end of the spectrum, lack relationality and connectedness with others because they are seen as not wanting to relate and to communicate to others. They seem to be content to live in their own world. However, it is a common mistake to interpret what we see as what they feel or experience. In this particular case, the contrary seems to be true. Some individuals with autism are too aware of their environment, with their perception being so sharp that it is painful. They cannot filter the irrelevant from the point of view of non-autistic people information. Their connectedness to others does exist, but it is of a very different nature. In fact, some can be spiritually sensitive or spiritually gifted, though so-called normal people may fail to see it. For the most part, their spirituality has been either devalued or completely unrecognized by those outside the family. The key seems to be in differences of their sensory perceptual functioning and cognitive and language development. People think of reality as some sort of guarantee they can rely on. Yet, from the earliest age I can remember, I found my only dependable security in losing all awareness of the things considered real. In doing this, I was able to lose all sense of self. Yet, this is the strategy said to be the highest stage of meditation, indulged in to achieve inner peace and tranquility. Why should it not be interpreted as such for autistic people? Unlike non-autistic people, most of whom are conditioned out of spiritual experiences soon after they start school, for some autistic individuals, spiritual reality is always part of their lives. Although everyone is predisposed to spirituality, some people and groups of people seem to be more spiritually aware or gifted than others. Recent research has shown that children are more spiritual because they are not yet restricted with cultural constructs. Children and animals, as purest of innocence, often perceive spiritual experiences only because they haven't yet been conditioned not to. Growing up, however, most of them lose or forget their ability. At times of personal tragedy, for example loss of someone they love, or stress, some individuals are more open to these experiences. It has been noticed that some people with what was once known as a mental deficiency or mental illness have profound spiritual and religious awareness. People with temporal lobe epilepsy have strong emotional and déjà vu experiences. My world was a spiritual body. It had been my home, myself, my life, my entire system of making sense of that bastard place called the world, writes Donna Williams, 1999, page 7. What makes autistic individuals more open to spiritual experiences is their sensitivities, sensory, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual, all caused by fundamental differences in their neurobiological development. Hay and Nye, 2006. Being holistic in nature, a deep sense of the whole, a sense of unity or oneness with everything, connectedness, relationality. To summarize, spirituality is something biologically built into the human species, a holistic awareness of reality which is potentially to be found in every human being. It is reflected in a heightened awareness or attentiveness, connectedness, relational consciousness, i.e., a holistic awareness of one's relationship with material world, with other humans, with oneself, and with God, that constitute spiritual awareness.